Well, here is my week 4 update. It's amazing. We're 4 weeks in. We got 10 more weeks to go in this semester. Um, so in this week, I want to start with talking about the Intro to Religious Studies class. Something that really was interesting in there is if you followed these videos, we've been talking about how to define what is a religion. So this week we spent more time on understanding how to define a world religion, which is a little bit different classification than just what is a religion. With this, though, I'd never really thought about this, but it was interesting that our professor had made the comment that to historically, in defining what is a world religion, what ended up happening is everything got compared against Christianity. So Christianity was held as the standard, then everything was compared against it, which I think makes some sense, just because Christianity is probably one of the most prolific religions in the world. And there's an argument to be made that Islam is definitely a major religion, in some places more spread out than Christianity. That would be true, but Christianity's been around longer as well. Islam doesn't start till the seventh and eighth centuries. So, Christianity's just been around a lot longer. But anyways, so it's just interesting that how do we define this? I wouldn't say that using Christianity as a standard is the ideal way to do it. I mean, I could see, because, with most of what we know about history coming through Europe, Christianity was the prominent religion through Europe, and so it kind of makes sense that it would be used as the standard and everything would be considered against it. But in today's world, when we know so much more about religions, I think we're going to have to change the rubric, change how we classify them to look at those things. But there's problems that come up with this, because again, what is a religion? Is a religion defined by having a belief in a God, or can you just have a belief in a supreme being? What does that mean for things like Hinduism and Confucianism, or Buddhism, for that matter? Where they don't necessarily believe as much in a divine God, some kind of a personage or something that's there, an intelligence or an entity. They believe more in energy, just energy around us, and being able to get yourself into a state of mind of reaching nirvana, reaching kind of a perfect state of mind that allows this ultimate enlightenment. Is that a religion? Could that be considered religion or not? There's a lot of different things to think about when classifying it. I think for world religions, it's a little easier, just because I think you can put the idea of geography and time in there. So a world religion could be something that has, a certain percentage of the world's population has adopted it, or a certain percent it has a presence in so many, a certain percentage of all the countries in the world. That could be a classification of a world religion, or it's been around for a certain period of time, maybe, is another way to think about that. So, which is important to look at, because, like Jainism, for instance, I did some studying into Jainism. That was one of my essays, was learning more about Jainism and comparing it. So Jainism is not the worship of Jain. Just I'm just kind of getting that out of the way first. Jainism is it's a break off of Hinduism. It kind of split off, when you have Hinduism, then Buddhism kind of came off of that. Hinduism is a little more about heaven. There is divine being. Buddhism's like, no, there isn't really heaven, divine being, but you're kind of trying to free yourself from the karma ideas of rebirth. If you don't get it right this time around, you get reborn again. I got to learn. So how can I get to a point where I don't get reborn anymore, but then go to the state of existence that is like pure excellence or something? Jainism kind of broke off from Hinduism as well, but it went more into the ascetic life. Like, how can I deny myself, my body things, so that I can improve my spirituality? It's been around for a very long time. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Jainism has been around. but it doesn't exist much outside of India. I mean, there's pockets here and there, but just because there's pockets here and there, would that mean it could be considered a world religion? I mean, it's not like most people know what it is. You've probably never heard of it until you watch this video, in fact, just because it's not a popular one. In fact, it's crazy. There's actually, in Jainism, there is two things that are really funny about this. Well, interesting, I should say, not funny, about Jainism is that there is a philosophy in Jainism that says you slowly lower the amount of food you eat until you get down to where you're not eating any food at all. So basically, there is a discipline within Jainism where you literally starve yourself to death, and that's this idea of ascetic living, denying the physical existence what it needs so that you can improve your spiritual existence. And literally, it's a practice. This is an actual practice. I think the India has made laws against it, so you're not allowed to do it anymore there. But it is a practice that sometimes happens where people will just slowly eat less and less. Like every week, you'll eat a little less, eat a little less, eat a little less, until basically you're not eating anything, and then you basically die. You're going to starve to death slowly, and but that's one of the disciplines of Jainism. It's kind of interesting. Now, most of you have probably heard, especially if you've done any study in philosophy, have heard the story of the six blind wise men that were brought to an object. They're filling an elephant, and they said, "Okay, we want you to tell us what this is. Describe it to us." And so, because each of the six wise men were filling a different part of the elephant, they all came up with different descriptions of what they were feeling. The one that was feeling the tail said it's long, fluffy, hairy, skinny, kind of a snake-like thing. The one that was feeling the elephant's ear was like it's kind of like has wings, big flappy things. It's soft. The one that was holding the trunk was like, no, this is like a big, thick. It's huge. There's some muscles in here. And the one that was feeling the leg was like, it's tough. There's some hardness and So because they felt different parts of the same animal, they didn't collaborate, and so they got different opinions of the same thing. And that's actually that philosophy, that concept, that story comes from Jainism. In fact, for LDS people, it was used in General Conference by Elder Uchtdorf 2 years ago, I think. It was around 2 years ago. He used that lesson in General Conference talk. That comes from Jainism, in fact, which is, again, a kind of branch off of Hinduism. But anyways, it was kind of fun, but just trying to understand more of how do you think about religion and what constitutes religion, what doesn't. If it's number of adherents, if you have X number of population, that's a religion. Could the NFL be a religion? That's the thing is, how do we say, here's the lines, everything inside these lines is religion, everything outside is not? That's where you have the problem with that. But it's kind of interesting to explore. So in my Christianity class, Intro to Christianity, this week we've spent more of our time in the, I guess you say, kind of the more familiar growth of Christianity. So we're probably like 1000 AD up into the 1800s AD. So that time frame. So this time frame we see a lot of Catholicism moving across Europe, getting into Ireland and up into England. Rome having an influence in some of those places as well. So things are moving and going that way. Whereas so what we would consider today Catholicism is spreading out. So Western Christianity is another way to phrase that. Another thing to consider is Eastern Christianity is still spreading around and moving, but it's gone through some changes because of Islam has now become a big deal. We've just kind of gone past the Crusades period, getting past the Crusades era, all those challenges and things. So the Byzantium Empire, which is the eastern half of the old Roman Empire. So Byzantium was like Turkey, some of the Balkan areas around there, that part of the world. Byzantium is a Christian nation, Byzantine basically. But then it collapses. The Turks come in, the Ottoman Turks come in and take over that area. And so that's where the Ottoman Empire comes from, which was there up until almost the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, and then it collapses as the rest of what we would call modern Europe today starts to come together and form on their countries. So the Christianity is spreading. It's moving. It's becoming more solidified. And it's interesting that at this time there was a huge discussion and debate between who has authority. So the church has claimed they have authority for spiritual things, but then the governments are saying, but we have authority over what's happening right now. You know, you can save their soul, but we have to have armies and governments and taxes and all these other things going on too. And so they kind of go back and forth. And the challenge is there's this power dynamic through Europe where the king and the pope kind of equally are there, but then sometimes they try to best each other. So sometimes the popes would say, hey, because we are ordained of God, we set apart the king. The king is below us. We give the king his authority. So we are higher than the king. But then sometimes the king says, no, I actually appoint the bishops in the church. And so I am higher than you. So there's this dynamic that happens over centuries, or sometimes it comes and goes. This is also the time of the Great Schism in Christianity. There was a problem in Catholicism at the time where, well, there's a couple of times that this has happened basically. There's one time where the Pope in Rome realized that they didn't feel like they were safe. Like the church, the headquarters of the church, their life wasn't really safe there because of shifts and changes in the dynamics of the country in Italy and other places. So they moved the headquarters to Lyon in France. They moved up to Lyon. So that the headquarters of the church moved up into France. And then everybody's like, no, this is terrible. This is heretical. We need to bring it back. And so there's like a huge crowd when they're trying to do the next pope. When that pope died, the next pope came in. The people uprose and went, hey, we can't do this. We've got to actually rein this in more. So that changed their opinions. And so they had to move the papacy back. But then France is like, but what about us? At one point in what's known as the Great Schism, Germany, France, and Rome basically had a pope, and they were excommunicating each other, and they were trying to vie for authority, and it really ran into some problems and challenges. And then they ran into the other issue of, well, what if the pope makes a bad choice? How do we overrule the pope? Because they've kind of built the pope up as being the ultimate say in everything, but what if the pope does something that goes against everybody else? So then they had to change with their thinking and say, okay, how do we adjust this? So now they tried to say, let's take the council of the bishops and make it equal to the pope. But then how do we decide this? So there's all kinds of like doctrinal shifts and challenges and things that were happening during that time in Christianity. So it was really, really kind of interesting to see some more into those concepts. And how philosophy, a lot of Aristotle, Platonism, different groups started to come in, and they're using philosophy to try to explain, who gets saved, who doesn't get saved. Is there, are we predestined to be saved? Is it, did God just say there's only a select group we're getting saved? And it's interesting because if you look at it, a lot of, and this happens even in our day and age, okay, culture eats doctrine for breakfast is a phrase that I've heard a few times. Not in this class, outside this class, in other studies. But it's interesting because when you think about the idea of like feudalism and the caste system that's so prevalent and common through ancient history, in that you have different groups of people. Okay, we're not all seen. Humans aren't seen as equal. There are your royalty, and then there's your other government leaders, and then there's like the good working class, artisans, craftsmen, and then there's the average person, and then there's slaves underneath that. And depending upon which group you're in determines your benefits in society. And it's hard to move up, basically, in those classes. So if you're born to a poor family, you're just stuck. Unless something crazy happens and you move up, Most of the time people moving up were women who, like a poor woman who is really good looking, a king says, I want you for my bride, so then she moves up. Or a man who becomes a warrior, like just a super intense warrior, does really good in fighting. The king recognizes his status, or you become a scientist. You have to have some special talents, otherwise you kind of stayed at those lower rungs and didn't go anywhere. So it's interesting to look at Christianity through this idea that, so they believed these were concrete concepts. They even believed when it comes to slavery, this was a way to think about it. Okay, when we think of racism, we think of colors or ethnicities differentiating people out. That's not how they did it back then. They looked at it as, what was your class? Basically, which class level were you in? Now, if you were an outsider, you kind of came in low unless you could prove you had a good status. If you couldn't, you were automatically down here. So they saw certain people, like blacks, for instance, was common to be seen as they are meant for physical labor better than white men are, and white men are better meant for intellectual labor. And so that's how they delineated that out. And supposedly there's like science research and stuff back then that proves it. In fact, even in the 1800s, throughout Europe and America, there were medical journals that were proving, at least in their eyes, they were claiming they could prove that blacks were anatomically different in some ways than whites, and were inferior to whites. And I mean, these are like legit medical journals that were being used at the time and seen as scholarly. I mean, we look at them now and go, that was baloney science, but that's what they had even through the 1800s. So the class system is the old racism, if you want to think about it that way. But seeing religion through this was interesting, that certain people got certain abilities, certain people didn't, and how that worked out was really interesting. In fact, the class system helped encourage and kept slavery around. In fact, even in the New Testament, slavery was a part of life. That's just the way it was. And so it kind of became somewhat justified in some ways. It slowly fell out of favor. It took a long time for slavery to fall out of favor, but there's a lot of cultural ideas and things that wrapped up into it that kept it around for a long time. So it was just some interesting ideas. All right, well, so the final class, my Chinese history class. So we're still in the very early times of Chinese history. Well, when I say that, we're like 700 BC to 200 BC time frame. So it's still pretty early. But what's interesting is how these dynasties turned out. So there's if I remember right, and forgive me, Professor Brown, if I screw this up. I'm trying to do this off the top of my head. The Xia dynasty is kind of a pre-dynasty, and then the Shang dynasty is kind of seen as the first official dynasty of China, around the 1000 BC time frame, or just before then, 1200 BC time frame. And then the Zhou dynasty. Now Zhou is spelled Z-H-O-U. That's Zhou. So if you ever see Z-H-O-U, that is Zhou. Okay, that's how it's pronounced, at least. It sounds more like Joe. The Zhou dynasty was a large dynasty, big dynasty. They were huge. It's interesting because they were really huge on values. We need leaders who have really good values, who are ethical, who are looking out for the interests of the public, those kinds of things. Well, they later ended up with a king that was a total jerk. He just thought of himself. He taxed the crap out of the people, enriched himself, threw crazy parties for him and his buddies. And then he was overthrown by another tribal group that came in and says, yeah, we don't like you. So the people rose up against them as well. And so the Zhou dynasty has kind of two sections to it. There's the main Zhou dynasty, and then there's which is Western Zhou, and then Eastern Zhou was when we have this period called the Hundred Flowers. It's called that because the Zhou dynasty basically splits into clans, and like 100 different clans come out. So there's all kinds of warring factions and warlords and things happening. They start to fight amongst themselves after the Zhou dynasty collapses. And it's during this time that we get because of all the warfare, and it just became the way of life back then for a couple of 100 years as they're trying to fight and vie and do all these things, that a lot of science, a lot of technology, a lot of philosophy come from them. So this is the time when Confucianism comes out. Confucianism is a lot more about studying the ancient text, using books to learn and to understand society and what's going on around you, basically. Taoism originates from this as well. If you're for the Tao Te Ching and other things like that, Taoism comes out, but Taoism is more about studying nature and learning from nature itself. And then another doctrine became popular back then called legalism. Legalism is the concept of, today we'd probably call it communism. Basically, legalism is kind of everything's about helping the state to grow and be successful. It's all about building the state up. And there's no individual efforts, it's all collective. And that takes over for a while. And so the how do I say it? The Jin dynasty, Qin, Jin dynasty, from more the western edge of what we're talking about here, they end up adopting legalism and taking over and creating one of the greater dynasties in Chinese history. And then later that becomes the second ruler of the Jin dynasty is the first emperor of China. And this is where the terracotta army he builds, starts building the Great Wall and other things in. So we're still this is still getting around 200 BC. So if you think about it, this is still at the same time in the intermediary period between the Old Testament and New Testament. When you think of like Christianity and Judaism, basically, China is going through this huge change themselves. So some really fun things, little tidbits and ideas, things we get to learn. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions about things, let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them. And we'll see you next week for the next update.